Brethren, a very good morning, a good afternoon, and good evening to you all, and thank you for joining us here today, despite the fact that there is a tiny little game going on today. It's a wonderful, wonderful crowd that we've got on. Thank you to the 223 who have joined us. As always, I'm going to start with the important housekeeping notes. The meeting is being recorded and will be posted onto our YouTube channel. Therefore, those of you who do not wish to be seen, please feel free to turn your videos off now. If you could also please avoid any disruptions, if you could please ensure that your microphones are kept on mute throughout. There will be an open Q&A session after the talk, and if you'd like to ask today's speaker a question, please use the raise hand icon, which can be found either in the participants or reactions tab. Once you have done this, you may unmute yourself, ask your question, but then please do not forget to put yourself on mute afterwards. To save your spot as always in the queue, you can do this at any time during the talk. And I would also like to remind brethren to please keep to questions relating to the topic of the talk and to avoid making any statements, including in the chat area. Now today, as brethren, most of you will know, we are dedicating this talk in memory of our late worshipful brother, Clive Elliott, who sadly passed away on the 19th of June in Malta. I would first like to call upon worshipful brother Giovanni Caruso, who would like to address the many Italian brethren who have joined us here today. Giovanni?
Good evening everybody, buonasera fratelli, e come sapete questa sera è dedicata a Clive. Lui è responsabile per una ventina di noi fare parte del marchio del Craft Mariner Knights a Malta, sotto il distretto inglese. È stato lui che ci ha spinto, è stato grazie a lui che siamo dove siamo oggi. Good evening, brothers. It's thanks to Clive that 20 of us are in the English district of Malta. You know, he helped us get through, and it's thanks to him that we are now part of the Mark, the Mariner, the Craft, the Knights, Rose Croix, and everything. Clive was a brilliant man, fantastic brother, and cheers, Clive. God bless you.
God bless. Thank you, Giovanni. Brethren, I would now like to call upon the Grand Inspector of Malta, group of lodges under the United Grand Lodge of England, very worshipful brother Richard Jump, to conduct an eulogy to worshipful brother Clive Elliott.
Brethren, members of Freemasons Without Borders, thank you very much for allowing me to say a few words about Brother Clive. Clive had a very long and distinguished army career, reaching the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major. As he already spoke about his time in the army, I sadly do not know which unit he was a member of, but it was certainly reflected in the fact that you could see your face in the shine of his shoes, and the fact that he was absolutely ramrod straight in his posture when in lodge. Clive came into Masonry only 15 years ago. It took a friend of his, David Elkin, some 10 years when they first met at Reuters in London to persuade Clive to join Freemasonry. The time apparently was never right, but in 2006, it was right. And Clive was initiated on the 1st of February 2006 into Isle of Thorney Lodge 6194 on the occasion of its 60th anniversary. And apparently he took to Freemasonry like a duck to water. And within a year, he was also exalted into chapter. Clive actually did take to Masonry like a duck to water, because within 4 years, he went through the chair, which is quite a feat in itself. But he did have a lot of help along the way. Apparently what Thorney Island, either Thorney Lodge, particularly remember was that at a moment's notice, he could deliver a long speech that commanded a hushed tone to all those assembled in the lodge and at the festive board. A talent which he sort of hid from us here in Malta when he came to Malta in his retirement. Maybe a wise decision, but we soon rumbled him and he became the secretary of the Rome Lodge. And yes, that is where many of our Italian brethren have now joined us. Clive was particularly good at mentoring, even before the lodge was formally created, office was formally created. He was an excellent support to the younger brethren and set them well on their journey, a skill set he continued here in Malta. Clive followed in the footsteps of his proposer and joined the various orders: Mark, Royal Ark Mariner, Knights Templar, Red Cross of Constantine, Rose Croix, probably helped by the fact that most of his craft lodges did actually meet at 86 St James's. During his time in the chair, just before he came to Malta, at the Ladies' Festival, Clive achieved something that the lodge had never done before. They struggled to break even for the Ladies' Festivals, but Clive managed to raise over £2,000, split between two charities, Finian's Gift and Macmillan's, one of those being a suggestion from his daughter Vanessa. His daughters have always supported his Masonic activities and have been regular attenders down at the Masonic Ball in Valletta when they come to see Clive. In about 2011, 2012, Clive was looking for a warmer climate, and he had many a holiday both here in Malta and in Cyprus, and somehow we won, which was a great asset to the group here in Malta. As I said, Clive joined us here in Malta, and he joined all the other progressive orders that meet here. And he was soon a member of our Masonic Hall Committee as the Deputy Chairman and Mark Mays, MMH representative and liaison with the other units, which to his horror, he discovered that we were continuing to grow. So we've pulled in 2 more of the progressive orders, and I have eyes on 2 more. Whether by design or not, Clive regularly received visits from his extended family. I understand that Clive was one of 10 or 11, I'm not too sure which, and his daughters made regular visits here to Malta. He did actually go to the UK for his 70th, and that was one of the few rare occasions when he did go back to the UK. As you know, Clive was a regular member here on Freemasons Without Borders, but as his health declined, he attended less and less. And the last few months, I must confess, have not been easy for Clive, but he was very well looked after by a certain lady, Linda, who was a very close friend. I'm particularly grateful to Giovanni for being able to attend the cemetery in cremation in Sicily, so his passing was not alone. Clive's wishes are that his ashes should be scattered on the playground in front of his flat in Bujava. I'm not too sure whether this is him getting his own back, because that playground apparently drove him mad. We've been unable to celebrate Clive's passing here as we would wish, and we're planning to hold a celebration of Clive's life in the Masonic Hall late in September. I know that a couple of members who are listening in at the moment should be coming here over to Malta. I think I'm going to sum up Clive in the words of his proposer. He said, "I lost a good friend and a good Mason." Thank you, Amit. Thank you.
One last thing, Ahmed, please. Richard, I don't know if you remember this. Clive always had a pin in his jacket, and once I asked him, what was that? And he very proudly said, "I'm a free man of London." You know, that was the pin given to him. He was a free man of London, given by the London Authority.
Thank you, Giovanni. I'm going to add that to my eulogy when I give it in Lodge. Thank you.
Richard, Giovanni, thank you ever so much. We were honoured and privileged to have met Clive through this platform, you know, in the early parts of when we started Freemasons Without Borders. And that was a wonderful tribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brethren, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Right Worshipful Brother Elkan Levy. Elkan, aged 78, was by profession a solicitor and served as the president of the United Synagogue before emigrating to Israel in 2011. He was initiated into Freemasonry in 1975 and holds grand rank in the United Grand Lodge of England, the Supreme Grand Chapter of England, and the Grand Lodge of Master Masons of England and Wales. He was the founding Deputy Grand Chaplain of the Metropolitan Grand Lodge of London, and for 5 years served as third Grand Principal of the Metropolitan Grand Chapter. Bro Levy also served as Provincial Grand Chaplain of Middlesex in both Craft and Mark, and has given the sermon at Masonic services in Guildford Cathedral and a number of synagogues. He served as Worshipful Master of Temple of Athene Lodge number 9541, the Masonic Research Lodge of Middlesex, and was for 9 years a member of the Commission for Masonic Appeal Courts. In Israel, Right Worshipful Brother Levy is Honourable Grand Almoner in the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel, and in January 2019 was installed as Third Grand Principal in the Supreme Grand Chapter of Israel. He also holds the 18th degree in the Rose Choir in the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite. At this point, I would like to also thank Worshipful Brother Alan Peters for putting me in touch with Bro Levy to bring this talk to you all. Right Worshipful Brother Elkan Levy, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother Amit. First of all, can I thank you for your tolerance, because I think this is the third date that we had to fix for this talk, and I'm really most grateful to you. Am I sharing the screen?
Not just yet, you're not.
Okay.
You are now. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I thought I was about at the beginning. Right. Pointer options. Can you see my little laser pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Brethren, the Holy Land is the supposed cradle of Freemasonry. All our Masonic legends take place in the Holy Land. But the first Freemasonry that we know about took place in 1868. There was a very strange character called Robert Morris.
Oh, for Christ's sake, move it.
Who had been the Grand Master of Kentucky, but was in rather poor odor in American Freemasonry for a number of reasons, one of which is that he had started the Order of the Eastern Star, and he had also started something during the American Civil War called the Conservators, which aimed to unify Masonic ritual right across the states and do so, if they had to, in quite a violent way. And he wasn't really very popular. But remember, this is an era when people go exploring to try and find ancient relics. This is the time when Schliemann excavated Troy. So Morris came to the Holy Land in order to try and find ancient Masonic relics. When he was there, he met somebody called Charles Warren, later Sir Charles Warren, who was the first worshipful master of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge in London, who was there in order to survey the Temple Mount. Indeed, there is a room to the left of the western wall, the kotel. These days, we use it as a synagogue when the weather's bad. But according to Warren, it was a lodge room from the time of King Solomon. Robert Morris found a number of Masons in Israel, or some of them were American officers in the American Navy who were in Jaffa. One of them was a very senior Turkish ruler. And in the end, he had a meeting in the Quarries using something called the Secret Monitor, which I understand is not the order of the Secret Monitor. And he held this meeting on the 13th of May, 1868. And Morris then went back and he wrote a book about it. about Freemasonry in the Holy Land. It's quite an interesting piece of work, setting out what he had done. And he then went back to America and tried to get a warrant to form another lodge in the Holy Land. And his own Grand Lodge wouldn't give it to him. In the end, he got it from a friend of his who was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Canada in Ontario, and he issued a warrant for something called the Royal Solomon Mother Lodge. Morris never came back to this country, and the lodge was run by a Maronite Christian called Alexander Howard, or Eskander Awad, who lived in Jaffa and owned most of the properties in the main street in Jaffa, which in those days was called Howard Street. It's now called Yefet Street. This is a view of the beginning of the street today. And he was a travel agent. The Holy Land is opening to travel. And he had, among other things, the Thomas Cook representation. And he owned the concession for running coaches between Jaffa and Jerusalem. And most of the coachmen joined the lodge because that was the way to get on. However, the brethren had very little knowledge of Freemasonry. Visitors who saw them were appalled at what was going on, and the lodge was finally erased in 1907. In the meantime, in 1891, a group of French engineers had come to build the Jaffa to Jerusalem railway, and they formed a lodge called La Porte du Temple de Salomon, the gate of the Temple of Solomon, which originally was affiliated to what's called the Rite of Mitzrayim, which was some sort of Egyptian lodge, Egyptian rite. In 1906, they joined the Grand Orient of France, which was possibly worse, and changed the name of the lodge to L'Aurore, the Dawn. That lodge still exists. It is now called Lishkat, the Lodge of Barakai, which is Hebrew for the dawn. It's perfectly regular, and it's lodge number 17 under the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel. But let's go on and see. We've got the beginning of the First World War in this area, which had enormous changes but a number of Freemasons were quite senior characters. One of the three rulers of Turkey at the beginning of the war, he was a really nasty character, was Talat Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who'd been Grand Master of the Ottoman Grand Orient in 1909. Another character who had major influence in this part of the world was KFK, Lord Kitchener of Khartoum. He was the British agent and consul general in Egypt from 1911 to 1914. He didn't like being British, or he didn't like British friends. And he used to say that he preferred his Arabic friends, which went down a bundle with his colleagues. But he was a very keen Freemason. He belonged to 15 lodges and chapters. He was the District Grand Master of Egypt and the Sudan. And he had been at one stage the Grand Master of the Punjab in India. At the beginning of the war also, there were negotiations with the rulers, Muhammad Ali, who was the ruler of Arabia, because Britain needed to keep Arabia on side because of the necessity of keeping the Red Sea quiet, because that was the route to India. And a lot of the negotiations were done very incompetently by this gentleman, who was Kitchener's successor in Egypt, who was regarded by his colleagues as being not terribly bright. But he was a very senior Mason. In 1915, he was the past senior Grand Warden. He was the District Grand Master of Malta. In 1923, he became past Grand Scribe Nehemiah. He had been the senior Grand Warden in the Mark degree. He held the 33rd degree. He was the founder and the first master of the McMahon Lodge 3262, which still exists and meets in Mark Mason's Hall. And he was the worshipful master of the Jubilee Masters Lodge in 1919. Things in the Middle East did not go particularly well for the British until in the middle of 1917, this man was appointed as commander of what was called the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. General Sir Edmund Henry Hindman Allenby. He was a senior, obviously as a senior cavalryman. He'd been the Inspector General of Cavalry. He'd had a pretty good Boer War. He had a very good war on the Western Front because he was prepared to think out of the box. And in April 1917, he'd commanded the Third Army at the Battle of Arras. And on the first day, he had advanced 3.5 miles against the Germans. Nobody advanced 3.5 miles against the Germans in one day. It just didn't happen. Lloyd George noticed this and wanted him to go and take over the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. He wanted him, but first of all, because he was a good general, and secondly, because Allenby did not get on with Douglas Haig, who was the commander-in-chief in France, and anybody who was Haig's enemy was a friend of Lloyd George. So Lloyd George finally persuaded him to go and take command, and as a passing shot said to him that he was to give Jerusalem to the British people as a Christmas present. He came out in June and actually didn't attack at all until October, but spent the time organizing things, giving a lot of morale back to the troops who'd been very badly beaten at the first and second battles of Gaza in March and April of that year, planning things very carefully, setting up ways of persuading the Turks that he was going to attack in Gaza, because actually on the 31st of October, he attacked 35 miles to the east in Beersheba. And by the end of that day had conquered the wells, which were very important because he needed the water for his horses, and badly defeated the Turks. And he then went on pursuing the Turks up to Jerusalem. And on the 9th of December, 1917, the mayor of Jerusalem, Hassan al-Husseini, this gentleman, went to the American Colony Hotel, which still exists, and borrowed a white sheet, which he never gave back because it's now in the Imperial War Museum. And he went out to the west of Jerusalem, where he attempted to surrender Jerusalem. First of all, to two cooks who said, "We don't want no Jerusalem, we've come for some hegs for our officer." Then to these two gentlemen, Sedgwick and Hurcomb. They were territorials from London, but what's interesting is look at how they're dressed. Jerusalem in December is very, very cold. They are wearing pith helmets. They've wrapped themselves up as warmly as they can, but they're still in cotton shorts because Allenby had conquered Jerusalem so quickly that the men's winter kit had not caught up with them. So he then, Allenby then formally entered Jerusalem on the 11th of December, 1917, and he didn't ride in. He got off his horse at the Jaffa Gate. This is a picture of the Jaffa Gate, and you'll see actually that there's no city wall because they had demolished this chunk of the city wall in 1897 so that Kaiser Wilhelm could get his coach through. Allenby didn't ride like the Kaiser, he walked, and said that he would not ride in the city where his savior had walked. And he came in and he proclaimed from the Jaffa Gate, and you can still stand there, it's the entrance to a museum these days, proclaimed the freedom of worship and safety for all the holy places. And this proclamation was read in English, French, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, Russian, and Italian. Jerusalem was then and still is a very polyglot city. So for the Jews, this was the first day of the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, the dedication festival, when the temple was rededicated in 135 BC. For the British, it was a Christmas present. And it was a tremendous morale boost because the war had been going on since August 1914. And this was the first clear victory that the British Army had had in the whole war. But he had some fairly distinguished guests. Shortly afterwards, in March, this posed photograph was taken at his headquarters. There's Allenby. There's Dr. McInnes, who's the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. A number of other characters who had been leading generals. But this gentleman, Freemasons will recognize. This is Field Marshal, His Royal Highness the Duke of Connaught, more commonly known to us as the Grand Master. When I gave this lecture once to a group in Jerusalem, an old man came up to me and he said, "I've got some postcards that I want to show you." And among the postcards were these two amazing images. This is Allenby and the Duke of Connaught going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to worship, walking through the old city. And this is them afterwards driving back in a Rolls-Royce armored car. But the next slide is quite amazing. A branch of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force Masonic Association was formed in Egypt under somebody called Brigadier General William Meldrum. And it came to Palestine in May 1917. And on the 6th of April, this group had a meeting, a Masonic meeting, in the Dome of the Rock. You can see quite clearly that is the mosque behind them. It still exists. And they had the meeting in the mosque, evidently because this gentleman, who was the caretaker, was himself a Freemason. This sort of thing these days could not possibly happen. It would be absolutely out of the question. At the same time, at the end of the war, it came to an end in October 1918 for the Turks, and Kemal Ataturk took over Turkey and modernized the whole state, and most of his entourage were Freemasons. And indeed, in the Muslim world, in the Middle East anyway, Turkey seems at the moment to be the only country where Freemasonry is freely practiced. Freemasonry in Turkey appears to be very strong, and the Turkish-speaking lodges in Israel are extremely strong. There were a number of Scottish and probably Irish lodges that came into Mandate Palestine with the forces. Records aren't clear, because if these were military lodges, then they probably had traveling warrants, and they would have withdrawn with the units when they were re-stationed somewhere else. But it seems that there were no English lodges with the forces. But the Scottish and, to a lesser extent, the Irish Grand Lodges were very keen to create lodges in Mandate Palestine, especially the Scottish lodges, who created quite a number of Hebrew-speaking Scottish lodges, which are still very active in Israel. There is one lodge called Elijah the Prophet, number 16, which was founded in 1936. That meets in Haifa, and it works both in Hebrew and in Arabic. But by 1923, the English Freemasons, who were senior, many of them were senior figures in the Mandate government, decided that they wanted to have an English lodge. And they therefore submitted a petition to the United Grand Lodge of England, which, among other things, had this remarkable statement that membership will be restricted to British subjects of British birth. An emphatic regulation will be inserted in the bylaws. And also, the consecration will take place within the precincts of the English cathedral by permission and at the strongly expressed wish of the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. In fact, that didn't happen, as we will see. But this is a list of the founders, and it is a list of the great and good of the British Mandate government in Mandate Palestine. Look, Sir Gilbert Clayton, Chief Secretary of the government, an acting High Commissioner, the Archdeacon of the Cathedral, the Assistant Governor of Jerusalem, Department of Public Works, Post and Telegraph, Treasury, the Imperial Bank, Controller of Stores, Palestine Railways, Department of Antiquities, Postmaster General, Judges, Anglo-Egyptian Bank, Inspector General of Police and Prisons. And the first master was going to be Brigadier Sir Gilbert Falkingham Clayton, who had been the past District Grand Warden of Egypt and the Sudan. In the end, because of his commitments within the government, he became the first immediate past master. There was a problem with the foundation date, and they telegraphed to London and said, "We're borrowing the furniture, but please let us know when we can actually hold the meeting." And in the end, the Grand Secretary, Sir Philip Colville Smith, came out and consecrated what became the Lodge of King Solomon's Temple, number 4611. Colville Smith, when he was out, collected a number of souvenirs as a tourist, and he deposited them in the library of the Grand Lodge in London, where they remain. In the end, the consecration did not take place in the Cathedral of St. George, but it took place in the Modistan, the Hospice of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem. The building still exists, although it's not used for Masonic meetings these days, but it was, during the Mandate period, the Masonic temple in Jerusalem. When Colville Smith consecrated the Lodge of King Solomon's Temple in 1924, he said the following. He said, "To see you gathered here in this place, with which the whole legend of the craft is associated, is an auspicious event within the annals of the craft. Freemasonry, through drawing on its main legend and all its symbolism from the Temple of Solomon and its builders, has acted on its legitimate connection with the city of Jerusalem. This is the first, pardon me, this is the first English lodge under the jurisdiction of the Mother Grand Lodge of the world to meet permanently in Jerusalem. There are a number of interesting members, and one of them is this guy. Worshipful Brother Frederick Kish was a lieutenant colonel, you see, CBE DSO. He was a past master of the lodge, and he attended and filed this card, but although he was past master of the lodge himself. When the Second World War broke out, he was an engineer and he was promoted to brigadier. He was the chief engineer of the 8th Army. He was the highest ranking Jew in the British Army, and he was unfortunately killed in 1943 when he accidentally stepped on a mine in Tunisia. But during his Masonic career, and his grandson is a member of the Knesset and has been a minister in the Israeli government. But he was very keen on Freemasonry, and he commissioned 3 gavels where the heads were made with stone from King Solomon's quarries, and at least one of them still exists. And somebody sent me this photograph of the gavel. Another lodge was needed in the main military camp in Sarafand, and on the same trip, Colville Smith consecrated the Lider Lodge number 4613, and in 1930, came back and consecrated the Lodge of the Four Hills, number 5185. The Lodge of King Solomon's Temple in due course sponsored a chapter, the chapter of the Temple at Jerusalem, number 4611, and a Mark Lodge, King Solomon's Quarries Lodge of Mark Master Masons, number 828, both of which still exist and meet in Mark Mason's Hall in London. But there was no secrecy about Freemasonry. This is a guidebook from the 1930s, I think, which actually lists the lodges. This must be actually pre-1930 because the Lodge of Four Hills isn't listed there, but the other four are. And as I say, of those four lodges listed there, 3 of them still exist. When Freemasons' Hall in Great Queen Street was opened in 1930, they needed 32 rough and perfect ashlars. And under the supervision of Lodge number 4611, those were cut from King Solomon's quarries and sent to London to be placed in the various temples. So next time you go into Great Queen Street and you see one of the ashlars, those come from the quarries in Jerusalem. But come the 1930s, there's the rise of Hitler in Germany, and we have to remember that the Freemasons were as much the victims of the Nazi regime as the Jews. And in 1930, seeing what was going on in Germany, the Grand Master of one of the Grand Lodges in Germany emigrated to Mandate Palestine with a number of his brethren, and they founded the Grand Lodge of Germany in exile. Grand Master was a man called Leon Muffelmann, and after he founded 5 German-speaking lodges, he then returned to Germany, where he was tortured and imprisoned for the crime of being a Freemason, and in due course died. The German Freemasons remained in Palestine and subsequently in Israel until 1949, and they then returned to Germany, where they were successful in re-establishing regular Freemasonry. But they left behind 5 German-speaking lodges, 4 of which still exist under the Grand Lodge of Israel. They used something called the German Schroder ritual. And to begin with, in the early days of the State of Israel, there was no shortage of German-speaking Masons. But recently, faced with a lack of candidates and members, the lodges have translated the Schroder ritual into Hebrew, and they are now flourishing. I belong to one of them. And there's a project underway to translate the Schroder ritual into English as well. Then in 1933, there was also something called the National Grand Lodge of Palestine, which was founded by the National Grand Lodge of Egypt. This comprised the lodges that had been operating under the Egyptian and French jurisdictions, but the English-speaking lodges didn't want to get involved because it had a connection with the Grand Orient of France, which was irregular. In 1948, there was the end of the British Mandate. Britain withdrew on the 15th of May, 1948. The State of Israel was proclaimed. War immediately broke out, so there were very few Masonic meetings for about 3 years. The English lodges, 2 of them sent their warrants back and the others withdrew to London, probably under the instructions of the Foreign Office. There were 5 Scottish lodges that remained: the Holy City, Reuven, Mitzpah, Sharon, and Aviv, and they formed the kernel of what became in due course the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel. By 1953, things had settled down, and the Masons in Israel wanted to form a Grand Lodge, and they asked the United Grand Lodge of England which refused to do so for somewhat dog-in-the-manger reasons. So they asked the Grand Lodge of Scotland, who were delighted to do it, possibly to annoy the Grand Lodge of England. And in 1953, the immediate past Grand Master Mason of Scotland, the Earl of Elgin and Kincardine, came out and erected a new Grand Lodge at a ceremony that took place in the YMCA in Jerusalem. Curiously enough, the United Grand Lodge of England did not recognize the Grand Lodge of Israel for 4 years until 1957, but at the same time said that English Masons who went to Israeli lodges would not be penalized. There were problems. There are always problems. There were problems because there were 5 Scottish lodges, and there were at that time 26 lodges under the National Grand Lodge of Palestine. And there was a real danger of the possibility of having 2 competing local Grand Lodges with only one recognized. So they came to a compromise. The 5 Scottish lodges petitioned for the erection of a new Grand Lodge and surrendered their warrants. Once the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel came into being, the National Grand Lodges surrendered their warrants. So the new Grand Lodge started with 37 lodges on its books, and the Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge of Palestine became the immediate past Grand Master. So what is the position these days? Oh, and this is the booklet of the consecration program, which is really quite interesting. Somehow or other, I got a copy. I'm not quite sure how, but it's quite a precious thing to have. This is the current Grand Master, Most Worshipful Brother Yehuda Shmulevich, who has worked his way up the ranks. The Grand Masters change about every 2 years, or sometimes they'll do 2 terms, so it's 4 years. Israeli Freemasonry works in 8 languages: Hebrew, Arabic, English, French, Romanian, Spanish, Turkish, and Russian. And within the next few weeks, a new lodge is going to be consecrated, which will work in Portuguese. The German Schroder ritual, as I say, is now worked in Hebrew. The Hebrew rituals, normal Hebrew rituals, are actually translations of the Scottish ritual, and the English lodges use Scottish ritual, except for one unusual lodge, Ra'anana 70. Ra'anana is a town outside Tel Aviv, which has been particularly favored by immigrants from South Africa. And Ra'anana Lodge works in what they call the Netherlands ritual, which is actually the South African ritual, and which is like nothing you've ever seen. There are in English Freemason, there are vague echoes of what goes on in the province of Bristol, but otherwise it's something quite unique. And a group of us recently joined that lodge, partly because it needed members, but particularly because we wanted to get a chance to work the ritual. When we open a lodge in Israel, we open 3 volumes of the sacred law: the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in English or Arabic, and the Quran in Arabic. There is a group on the web called Bonim Hazmana, which means invitations to Freemasons. And every secretary files a copy of their summons with the webmaster of Bonim Hazmana, who then sends it out to all the Freemasons in Israel. To begin with, I was on the list only for craft and chapter, but when I joined the Ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, I was added to that as well. You don't need a formal invitation. You can really just phone up the secretary and say, I'm coming. There's no real problem with dining because festive boards are very, very informal. It's usually only one course. There's no bar beforehand. Normally, the catering is done by the brethren, which brought in from outside. It can be very simple, so salad, maybe some hummus, chicken or something like that. And it's considerably cheaper than in London. If I pay 50 shekels for a meal after a lodge, which is about 11 or 12 pounds in English money, that's probably quite expensive, except usually for installations, you may go to a hotel and it's much more, but on the summons, they will actually tell you how much you'd have to pay. Most lodges meet monthly, some every other month, except that generally they don't meet in July, August, and September. One of the lodges that I belong to, of which I'm particularly fond and proud, is something called Montefiore Number 78. So Moses Montefiore was the leading English Jew and possibly the leading world Jew in the 19th century. He was a Freemason. He belonged to the Moira Lodge, which is now number 92, and we have his Grand Lodge certificate. In 1864, for his 80th birthday, a lodge was formed in London called the Montefiore Lodge number 1017. And shortly after his death in 1885, he was over 100 when he died, Lodge Montefiore number 753 in Glasgow was formed. And the two Montefiore lodges worked very closely together. And one evening, working with a cousin of mine, we thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a third Montefiore lodge? So we got permission and we formed Montefiore 78, whose first meeting took place in the Quarries, with brethren from all over the world, including a significant delegation from the Grand Lodge of Jordan. Freemasonry is illegal in Jordan, which meant that the Grand Lodge of the Kingdom of Jordan had as its Grand Master His late Majesty King Hussein. Welcome to the Middle East. This is a map of the Israeli temples. They stem from up in the north, Haifa, and Acre, Nazareth, Tiberias, quite a lot down here, Netanya, Petach Tikva, Rehovot, Tel Aviv, down to Ashdod, Jerusalem, Beersheba, and down in Eilat. This is my Israeli craft regalia. Those of you who recognize it will see that it's largely Scottish. It's actually designed, the aprons are designed to be made on a machine. So the aprons are very cheap. And the only badge of rank in Grand Lodge is this jewel. So promotion is actually very, very cheap. It's much cheaper than having to buy a new apron as in England. And that's my founder's jewel of Montefiore Lodge number 78. And that's the Gardens of Netanya Lodge, an English-speaking lodge, of which I am a member as well. But that's the reverse of the lodge, of the apron, because in Schroder ritual, as part of one of the ceremonies, everybody takes off their aprons and reverses them, and the aprons have to be in black. Chapter started as a province of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria under the Scottish Constitution. Then it was a district of the Scottish chapter, and then it became independent. And we work 3 degrees in chapter: Mark, Excellent Master, and Royal Arch. And we're also responsible in chapter for the cryptic degrees, the degrees of captivity, and Royal Arch Mariner. This is my Israeli chapter regalia. As third grand principal, you'll see that the colors are Scottish rather than English. These are the jewels, Mark, that's Excellent Master, and that's chapter. And this is the special chapter jewel that we issued for the 50th anniversary of Supreme Grand Chapter. On the 29th of January, and we have had Royal Arch Mariner meetings as well. In January 2020, we had a special meeting in King Solomon's Quarries. This is the entrance to the Quarries. It's a long walk down And when you get down, you can actually see how our ancient brethren cut the stones. Do you see these grooves? What they would do, and the stone is quite soft when it's first cut. What they would do is cut a groove and pack the groove with dry wooden wedges and then throw water over the wood so that the wood would then expand and break off the stone. And that left an enormous hall. This is the quarries. The quarrying left this huge opening. You can actually seat 300 Masons at a meeting here because I've done that. And this is a view of the 50th anniversary meeting of the Supreme Grand Chapter. Those were the three principals when we opened the chapter, with a whole group of delegations from abroad. And as part of the ceremony, I worked a mark degree. As third Grand Principal, I'm the senior mark Mason in Israel. I worked a mark degree which had 18 candidates. So there was representative candidates, but a lot of them, believe it or not, had come from Western Australia. That's myself and Yaron Salim, who is the first Grand Principal during the ceremony. But that's not the only meeting that we've done in the quarries. And this was a meeting in September 2018, where a group of 75 Masons came from Iceland. They actually chartered a plane because they all brought their wives. And this is how they dress in Iceland. It's very interesting because it's a Christian degree. And we had a sort of joint meeting down in the quarries. And the third thing that we have in Israel is the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. This is the arms of it. And this is Moshe Barbaras, who is the Sovereign Grand Commander, an immigrant originally, I think, from Argentina. And I've done the Rose Choir, the 18th degree, which probably may shock many of my Christian friends because it is de-Christianized, but clearly has Christian traces in it. It's a most interesting degree, and I've done that. And let me finish off with this. These are the arms of the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel. They carry within themselves not only the square and compasses, but the Star of David, the cross and the crescent, the arms of the signs of the three great faiths. Freemasonry in Israel is open to all brethren, and it's one of the few areas where people of different faiths meet upon the level and part upon the square. In my lodge in Netanya, we have Christian and Muslim brethren as well. It's an English-speaking lodge. It can sometimes be stressful for an English Mason to be a Mason in Israel when things are done completely differently to the way they are done in England. But it's a very great privilege, and it's a very important part of Israeli society. Brother Amit and brethren, thank you for listening to me.
Right, Worshipful Brother Elkan, thank you ever so much. A wonderful talk, really well researched. Thank you ever so much for giving us the time to present today. I'm going to go straight to the questions. There's quite a few hands in the air, so we shall go to Georgina first. Hi, Georgina. Just remember to unmute yourself. Georgina? Oh, perhaps we've lost Georgina. We'll come back to Georgina. Brian Prince. Hi, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. Good evening, Elkan. Nice to see you.
Hello, Brian.
Very quick question. Do the lodges working the Brooder rites in Hebrew wear the top hat as the pilgrim does in London?
No. It's a bloody good idea, and I might try and introduce it, but I'm likely to get shot down in flames. Things are much more informal here. There isn't even the sort of formality that you get in England with different colors for different aprons, as it were, especially in chapter, where you will start with white tassels and then go to red and then go to blue. Nothing like that happens in this country. It is very informal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Georgina, you
No,
on?
thank you. Sorry, I couldn't get it. Hi, Elkin. Oh,
Hi.
recording, not recording. Elkin, hi again. I wanted to ask you, in Israel, and obviously you're Jewish, how do you manage with the higher degrees? Because in England, being Jewish, I can't join a lot of the higher degree or separate degrees because they are Christian based. So how do you manage that in Israel?
You mean the ancient and accepted, the Scottish rite, as it were?
Yeah, if you like.
It's only in England that they are exclusively Christian.
Oh,
That order was actually founded in America, oddly enough, by a Jew. And there are some chapters in America, as I understand it, that are exclusively Christian and others that are not. In this country, there is nothing that is exclusively Christian or exclusively Jewish or exclusively anything. As in the tradition of Freemasonry, you don't ask anybody their religions. So I understand, I mean, I can see in the 18th degree traces of the Christian ritual, but it is not overtly Christian, and I have no difficulty with it. But on the other hand, you know, even in England, there are traces in chapter, which is, as it were, de-Christianized. You begin with two prayers, magnificent prayers, that come straight out of the Book of Common Prayer.
yeah.
So there's always bits of religion around, but you try not to. There's actually in chapter, there's not only quite some interesting traces of Christianity, but there's an awful lot of Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, yeah, I realize that. Okay. Thank you, Elkin. And thank you. I sent you a message in the chat. If you can catch it before they delete it, it's about our last meeting.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Georgina. Next, could we go to Brother Maher Killick? Hi, Maher.
Hi, Amit. Thank you. Brother Elkan, I'd like to thank you very, very much for this presentation. It's been a wonderful information that you have shared with us. I have two questions. As you have confirmed to us that you have Supreme Council and you've got progressive orders in Israel. And I'd like to ask, what influence or control do they have on Craft Grand Lodge, if they have any? Do you think Craft Grand Lodge has any saying or overruling beyond these 3 degrees they control, such as progressive orders?
There's nothing formal, but there's a great deal of informal interaction. There's only about 1,500 Masons in the whole of Israel. So anybody who is active in one order is likely to be active in the whole lot of the others. So formally, no. Informally, yes, there is. And we cooperate on all sorts of things. Cooperate on temples, cooperate on things like health regulations and COVID and so on. We try not to fight, and generally we don't.
Sorry, Maher, did you have another question?
Yeah, no, that's all. That's all.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew, hi, Matthew.
Hi, Amit. Brother Elkan, that was really wonderful. Thank you ever so much. Learned so much. And from my days of teaching history, GCSE and Palestine and Jerusalem, fantastic. Thank you. I was interested to see that quite a 3 of the 4 lodges under the English Constitution at the time met, or the other constitution met on a Saturday, which seems fairly extraordinary to me on the Sabbath. Do you avoid the Sabbath now in the Israel Grand Lodge, so that and
Yes.
other holy days?
We avoid holy days. We avoid holy days of all faiths, so that a Jewish lodge will not meet on Christmas. We don't meet on Friday nights and we don't meet on Saturdays, but we do meet on Sunday evenings.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Always good to see you. Next, can we have Othman? Hi, Othman.
My question is regarding ink. You mentioned few characters. One of the most characters I was interested in knowing is Landis Petrie. He was a member of King Solomon Lodge. And one Freemason that was known in the Middle East, which started his journey in Jerusalem, is called Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who was from Persian origin. And he was very influential in bringing all the religion together into one lodge. Any more news you got about the two persons?
That's very interesting. I need to actually get more. What you've said has opened a gate of research. If I may, I'll come back to you on that.
No problem, brother. One side question: a lot of the Alexandria lodges who closed in the 40s and the 50s and came to Israel, and are any of them still in existence?
Sorry, a lot of the what lodges?
The lodge in Alexandria in Egypt, they were forced to close in the 50s and the 60s by the Egyptian government, and 2 or 3 of them were Jewish lodges, and we don't know if they continue in Israel or not.
Not as such, but there are a lot of Egyptian Jews who made their way to Israel, and indeed one of my close friends, who is currently thrice potent master of the King Solomon Lodge of Perfection, was an Egyptian Jew.
I know him, that's why I ask.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Othman. Thank you. Next, can we go to Stephen? Hi, Stephen.
Sorry, I've just unmuted myself.
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you? It's good to see you looking so well.
And you, sir.
I have to thank you for what effectively is a tour de force. You've gone through 160, 150 years of Masonic history of Israel in no time at all. And it was amazing. But I have 2 questions. Sorry, Amit, I know you don't like asking 2 questions. First of all, you have multilingual lodges and chapters. How do you decide, for goodness sake, for each meeting, which language you're going to work in? Or is it, do you have a set schedule so that you know whether you're going to work in English or Arabic or Hebrew or what?
No. You misunderstood me. Whereas the Grand Lodge of England works in English, 2 exceptions, we work in 8 different languages, but not simultaneously. The only lodge that does work sometimes in English and sometimes in Arabic is Elijah the Prophet. But you can get joint meetings, which is something that you don't normally get in English Freemasonry. I think it's something they borrowed from Scotland. So I have been to a joint meeting of an English lodge, a Hebrew lodge, and an Arabic lodge, which was opened in English. They worked the degree in Arabic, and then they closed in Hebrew.
Sounds like the Tower of Babel to me.
It's very interesting, actually. Going to watch a degree in Arabic is quite fascinating, because you don't understand what's being said, but you can follow the whole ritual very easily. You're really there are some lodges, for instance, that sometimes work in Hebrew because they haven't yet worked out how to do it in Russian. There is a Russian-speaking lodge known as the Mozart Lodge. And and they work in Russian, but they haven't got an installation. So the Mozart installation last week was done in Hebrew. You will find that going to I can go to a Hebrew speaking lodge, and if I have difficulty asking my question in Hebrew, so I will simply go into English. Most people will understand me anyway. What I am very proud of is that recently I installed a third principal in a chapter, and then installed him as the Worshipful Mark Master, and I did it all in Hebrew.
Thank you. My second question, sadly over the very recent past, there has been a lot of antagonism between Arabs and Jews, mainly, I understand, extremely Orthodox Jews. But how is behavior in that sort of way regulated in your lodges and chapters? Is it you're on your best behavior no matter what your attitudes are outside of the temple?
I've never had any of that sort of problem at all. You can get really violent behavior in meetings of the Grand Lodge. There's a meeting in the Grand Lodge this evening which I switched off because it was getting a bit too loud. This is before I started talking here. And there's none of the respect given to senior rulers in the craft the way that there is in Great Queen Street. But in lodges themselves, no, there are no rows. The only problem that I've ever noticed is of the Arab master of, I think, the Lodge of the Holy City, which meets in Jerusalem, who felt uncomfortable on one occasion about coming into Jerusalem because he lived, I think, somewhere in the West Bank. And he felt that if he came into Jerusalem for a lodge meeting, he might well get attacked by other Arabs. There have been problems between the PLO and Freemasons in the land of Israel, who have tried to stop Arabs becoming involved in Israeli lodges.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much. If you see my cousin Brian Wolkheim, send him my best regards.
I will.
Thank you, Stephen. You're not allowed to ask one next week now.
Oh, go on. He's a very old friend of mine.
Rules are meant to be broken.
Could I call upon Gary Mando? Hi, Gary. You'll have to unmute yourself, Gary.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I bring regards from Right Worshipful Gil Savitsky. He was the grand representative to Israel for many years, and his brother, I believe, was the city planner for many years. He's told me some great stories about meetings in Israel. Zedekiah's cave, did I say that right?
Yeah, Zedekiah's cave.
Zedekiah, I'm sorry. So is that part of the quarry?
It's another name for the quarry. It's the same place.
Okay, so there's an annual meeting there?
Not annually, because running a meeting there is a very big and very expensive business. You have to bring in all the chairs, you have to bring in all the furniture. You have to have extra security. You have to have armed guards at the front. It's something that is reserved for particularly important meetings. I go there approximately once a year, but that's just how it happens to work out. Sometimes for craft, sometimes for chapter. I've been there for the 50th anniversary of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, which was a big international gathering. But it's a most amazing place to work, because as a Freemason, you look around and you think, this is where they cut the stones for the temple. And this is where they finished the stones. You know, in Masonic ritual, we say that at the building of the temple, there was not heard the sound of metallic tool. That's because all the hacking and banging took place in the quarries themselves. And they then moved the stones, some of which weighed hundreds of tons, out on rollers and put them into place.
So there were still rough stones at that point.
When they were rough stones, when they were cut, when they were taken out, they were finished.
Oh, really?
And what we know is that they then put the stones, these huge stones, I mean, you can see them in the Western Wall, they're enormous. The stones were mounted on top of other stones with a whole lot of little lead balls in between them, so they could maneuver the top stone and get it exactly right. And then the lead would simply distort and the stone would remain fixed.
How can I try and speak?
Are there any women's Freemasons in Israel?
There are a lot of women, there are quite a number of women Freemasons, but there's no women Masonic lodges. Oddly enough, I was talking to Christine Chapman about this last night. There are a number of English lady Freemasons, some of whom undoubtedly you will know. And I suspect that if there was a movement to start a women's lodge in Israel, it would be warmly welcomed by the Grand Lodge of the State of Israel, because it would mean more Freemasons.
I'd be there. I'd be there.
Thank you. Brother, could we go to Helio da Costa, please, next? Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to know regarding the pronunciation in Israel of passwords, and because here, of course, I'm in Canada. I'm, not only for the craft degrees, but the Royal Art and for the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite. Because once I was at a meeting and
sorry,
the word was, pardon me?
I could stop you there. We don't discuss any secrets or signs. Or
no, I'm not asking the word, but I'm saying that we know that there are passwords, etc. within Freemasonry, and they have, a lot of them have Hebrew origins, and the pronunciation of them. And the issue is, I was at the meeting, and of course I gave the right Hebrew pronunciation of the word, and I was corrected. Of course, I didn't say anything. I just repeated the word the way it's given. But since this has the Freemasonry in Israel came from Scotland, so those passwords and the words, not only words of some of the personages within the legend, were also imported from an English-speaking world. Do you actually in Israel use the proper Hebrew words, or do you keep the words as they are pronounced, as they were given to you once the Grand Lodge of Israel was formed?
You've actually asked something about which I had a row 2 weeks ago. There was a joint meeting in Haifa where we did a 3rd degree, and I was doing part of the ritual, and I was given these words to pronounce, and I said very friendly, this is nonsense, and we're here and we are Hebrew speakers, and we ought to alter them. I was overruled, but completely said, no, that's the way we've done it, and so on. But what was very interesting is that when another brother actually, to begin with, gave him the passwords, he gave them in their corrupted form, and he then said, but in Hebrew, they should be pronounced as. So it came out, it did come out clearly. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that we should we should alter. We sometimes will tend to use Hebraized words. For instance, some of the words Hebrew, sometimes we will pronounce a proper name in Hebrew rather than in English.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I was curious about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helio. Thanks for joining us. Brethren, we're fast running out of time. We have literally about 5 more minutes left, and I've got a fair few hands up. So if we could just try and get through these as quick as possible. Brother Sivas, if you'd like to come on and give your question, please.
Brother, while narrating the early part of the history of Freemasonry in Israel, you used the term Marano to describe one of the brethren. Marano conversos are usually unidentified, and they don't reveal their identity, and even probably among Masons. And how was it that he was identified? And in general, is there some understanding or some convention whereby Marano conversos are known and they are a little relaxed about their true origins or true identities, at least among those who know that they are Maranos?
You are going into a fascinating. I'm not sure that I mentioned Maranos. There were Maranos possibly in the early days of the Grand Lodge of England, but that's a complete different subject. Maranos are Spanish Jews who had to hide their Judaism and who are now, as it were, coming out and declaring themselves to be Jewish. It's a fascinating story that you've started, but I couldn't possibly deal with it. It's another lecture. But thank you for asking that question, because that's very interesting.
Thank you so much. Next, could we go to Brother Murat? Hi, Murat.
Hello. Yeah, I'm muted myself. Hello, right, worshipful Brother Elkan. I have 2 questions to ask you. One is that there are some grand lodges over the world who refuse or who strongly oppose Mark Masonry and Royal Arch Masonry. So do these grand lodges, craft grand lodges, do they have any jurisdiction over these lodges in their territory? Like, do they need to be taking, like, do you need some authorization from them? That's the first question I'd like to ask. Second question I'd like to ask that, what are your feelings about these grand lodges who refuse Royal Arch Masonry? Thank you.
I'm not aware. I must tell you, I was not aware of lodges that are against chapter. They certainly do not impinge on us in Israel. I think it's wrong, because I find chapter to be not only, as it were, the conclusion of craft masonry, but one of the most wonderful and colorful and brilliant orders, and most of my big Masonic involvement has been in chapter, and long may it continue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, could we go to Gary Harris? Hi, Gary.
Hey, Brother Amit, thank you very much. Brother Elkan, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I hope it's not too frivolous a question. You mentioned earlier on the lodge with drivers of carriages from Jaffa to Jerusalem that was disbanded in 1907 after people were appalled at what was going on. Can you tell us any more?
No, I simply don't. I simply don't know. There were I know reports that went on that were sent back to the Grand Lodge of Ontario, because it was an Ontario lodge. There were not. They didn't file stuff. The secretaries didn't bother. In the end, I'm not sure whether they actually struck it off, or whether it had actually died and then they struck it off. But we actually don't know very much about that. We know quite a lot more about the next one the one that the French engineers started, because as I say, that still exists. And although it works in Hebrew, it has a very unique Hebrew ritual, which reflects a lot of its early days.
Thank you. Be well.
Thanks, Gary. Wonderful. Next, we go to David, please. David Burgess. You may be on mute, David.
Right. Mine is a very simple question. Bearing in mind the relationship of the Knights Templar with the Eye Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, what's the relationship of the craft with the Eye Hospital in Jerusalem?
It doesn't exist. We've not. I mean, I'm aware of the Eye Hospital, but for completely different reasons, because I used to be involved with Moorfields. But there is no particular relation. There is relation between the craft and a number of hospitals in Israel. And my Netanya Lodge sponsors a scholarship to train a nurse every year. But as far as I know, there is nothing with the Eye Hospital. It's a good question, but I don't think there is. Certainly, if they wanted something, I suppose they might actually approach us, but that's not happened.
Because I know the KT in UK donates a large sum of money per annum, also for the outreach hospitals as well. And I just wonder whether the craft had any involvement.
No, but remember, we don't have KT in this country.
No, that's true.
There has been discussion recently about starting OSM, but whether that will happen, I don't know.
No, that's true.
Great.
I appreciate that. Thanks ever so much. Take care. Nice to talk to you.
Next, Alan, Brother Alan.
Yeah. Good evening, Elkan. Thank you for an amazing talk. Just a quick question, please, if I may. I'm sure you're aware that in UGLE, we have the universities scheme, and in fact, we've even lowered the age of admission in certain instances down to 18. Is there any movement, so to speak, to try to attract younger people in Israel? When you've got, so to speak, a captive market in the army and what have you. Is there anything in that respect?
Not formally, no. In the English-speaking lodges, we have a problem because most of our members are immigrants who have retired, and that is it's something we are discussing, because we need younger members, and we actually haven't got them, and especially in where I live in Netanya, so all the English speakers are retirees, as I am. There isn't, but on the other hand, we're getting a higher profile, and it's something that I really want to push.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. David Curran, I did see your hand up, but it's gone down. Did you want to ask a question? I know you're very
Elkan. Lovely to see you. I just wanted to refer back to the pronunciation of the words on the question that came out, and it brings back memories of about 50 years ago when I think you got me into some trouble at West Smithfield Lodge.
David, you got me into all sorts of other things. Like you were the one who proposed me into chapter in 1980. So I have no sympathy for you with it.
But it brings back lovely memories.
Yes.
What a night to have a talk when England's playing football.
Thank you, David.
We won 2-0, by the way.
Marilyn's had her hand up for quite a while. She hasn't put the hand, she's actually got a physical hand up.
Oh, actually, Marilyn, if we can go to you very quickly before we close off for today. You're on mute.
Trying to unmute. I just wanted to say what an honour it has been for me to be present at this talk. My husband, who's just died, always spoke so highly of Elkan Levy, That's Maurice Podro. I don't know if he knows him personally. And obviously David Cohen. Just thank you so much. But I wanted to tell you that Sheila Norden, who is a past Grand Master of women Freemasons, she did try very, very hard to start up a ladies' lodge in Israel and was was unsuccessful.
Thank you for that. And I didn't know that Morris had died. And please accept my condolences. I have very happy memories of him.
Thank you.
Please
when I
accept
was
our condolences as well.
Thank you.
It's a wonder for you to join us today. I'm glad you have the opportunity to. Brethren, well, that brings us to our conclusion for today. We have gone over time, but it was well worth it. A wonderful talk.
I thought you knew him.
Honestly, thank you so much for that amazing talk.
When I saw
bear with me.
It's been a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
It has. Thank you. Brethren, next week we are delighted to welcome back Robert Cooper for his talk, which is part 2 for his previous talk. Is there a connection between Freemasonry and the Knights Templar? Same time, same place. God bless you all. Well done, England. We're through to the next round.
Thank you. Thank you, Elkan.
Thank you, everybody.
Especially Elkan. What a fantastic call. Well done.